Welcome back to everyone joining us. This is the third of our VHS tape series. If somehow you find yourself here and you aren't currently a member of the VHS, please do join us with our usual plug at the vhs.thenvm.org. Lovely to see you all. For the uninitiated, this is the Videogame Heritage Society's monthly series of online events where Mikey, hi, nice to meet you all, a curator at the NVM. I'm in conversation with a special guest about preserving and sharing video game heritage. A little bit about the VHS, again, just a reminder, we provide advocacy, support and expertise on the collection, preservation and exhibition of digital games. And if you follow the link of the VHS, you might already be with us, to join us on our discourse forum. Currently, we're talking about hot topics such as storage options of cloud versus hard drive storage, which is actually, or dry it may be, it's a vital topic of importance. Just make sure that everyone in the audience you're muted and your camera's switched off. As always, there'll be a short Q&A section at the end, so you can get your comments into the chat while we go through. Usually at this time, I like to thank Claire and Lex from the VHS team on moderating for us. And once again, thank you very much. But also, thank you very much for organising this event while I've been MIA with submitting my PhD, which I submitted last week. So as life goes on, events like this, thank you, Conor. It's nice to get back into the swing of things with these events. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. And sort of in celebration of the National Videogame Museum reopening in 23 days time on the 21st of May. Mm-hmm. I think I'm joined today by Conor Clarke, the reductively known as the Marketing and Communications Officer for the National Videogame Museum and the BGI. However, that one sentence does Conor no service at all. A man of many talents and a huge advocate for video games. He's launched recently in the last month our first Games Careers Week. He co-runs our award-winning virtual education programs. He promotes collecting initiatives such as the Animal Crossing Diaries, which our open call ended last month, and we're now plotting the program out in the coming months. It's going to be very exciting. He's founded and currently runs the Sheffield Video Games podcast, and I've got quotation marks here, bringing together those who play, work, love, and live everything games related in the Steel City. But most illustriously of all, in my opinion, is Conor's stellar work on the NVM's Twitter feed, most recently commemorating, of course, Ed Bull's Day, the 10th anniversary. Conor, thank you for joining me.
Oh, wow, that was very lovely. Thank you, Mikey.
That's all right. I've worked with you long enough now that I can list off your achievements very quickly. Honestly, that Castlevania tweet was perfection. We talk about video game curation. That Twitter feed is a very curated piece of beauty, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I've been I've not been using it as much as I should have, because I've been kind of concentrating on reopening stuff. But any chance I get just to throw a silly video game meme, retro video game meme, I'll take the chance. My Metal Gear Solid one from a couple of weeks ago is one that I'm particularly proud of as well, even though it didn't get nowhere near as many likes as I'd hoped it would have. But yeah, it was still funny.
Isn't it the thing with artists? They're never appreciated when they're alive, but posthumously.
Oh, I'll take that. Yeah. One day people will look back at the National Video Game Museum Twitter account as a canvas of great comedy art. I don't know.
I think so. I think that's fair. So how did you? Let's talk about sort of before the NVM. How did you get involved with the NVM? What's your background with the medium?
Yeah. So I suppose at its simplest level, I was basically hired to just do marketing for the museum, and just concentrate on kind of promoting the visitor attraction itself. The visitor attraction, which is based right in the centre of Sheffield. So I was fortunate enough to be based while I was living in Leeds at the time, and had marketing background. I was working as a marketing kind of a marketer for a business consultancy, which was kind of really far away from museums or culture or anything that I also had done previously to that. So it's base level. I was just hired as a marketer. However, once kind of starting at the organization, I realized that my kind of background, actually, I share a lot of, share a similar background with many in the organization as well. So like many that started the organization that still work in the organization now, my background is actually in theatre. So I trained as an actor. I had my own theatre company at one point. I produced kind of, or co-produced some theatre festivals down in Devon. And, you know, took on a lot of kind of a few kind of marketing responsibilities here and there. And eventually I got really into theatre research and theatre kind of academia. And I moved to Leeds to study for a PhD and teach theatre at the University of Leeds, where my specialism was all around live art and performance art, and how live art, this art form that kind of relies on people being in a space, interacting with something in front of them, how that kind of was kind of translated into digital formats. So you can already see this kind of, there's some sort of relation to video games there. And a lot of my research, actually a lot of my teaching as well, was always related around the theatre of video games. So that's kind of where my background came into. I started marketing kind of escape rooms as well, something that's kind of also very video game and also theatre related. So, and then eventually ended up exactly where I am. So yeah, that's kind of my background, and gives me a bit of some sort of kind of, you know, initial context before working at the museum around ideas on video game preservation, because obviously my research was about theatre preservation, at least through digital formats. So there are some overlaps there.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really interesting intersection from where your personal ethos on the medium as a sort of performative tool also stems into sort of how the organization conceives of preserving and exhibiting digital games. So, I mean, do you want to give us a little insight into the sort of nucleus of the BGI and the NVM from, was it Game City?
Yeah. So the organization that runs the National Videogame Museum has been around for about 15 years now, I think. So it was kind of started, the nucleus of the idea, it was started from our creative director, Ian Simons, who was kind of working as a games journalist and was kind of talking about games and talking to the public about kind of games creators. And the way Ian describes it is that he wanted to create a festival, an exhibition of sorts around games, because he went to places like E3 and these kind of, you know, bigger kind of video game exhibitions, and found them a really rubbish way of exhibiting games, right? Not necessarily because, you know, you go to these places, there are these big kind of warehouse halls, and you kind of queue up behind 100 people to have 5 minutes playing this brand new game that's not out yet. You don't really get to play it. You don't really get to enjoy it. And it's just kind of the whole experience just blends into this weird kind of meat grinder, I suppose, of kind of just processing players in to come and try these new games out and have a quick play on them, and then off you go, try a new different game. And it's just, it's not really conducive to a really good playing experience, right? Or a really good kind of interaction between a person and the game, or even the processes behind the game, right? A lot of these kind of video game exhibition halls were sold as, you know, you could meet the creators in a way, meet the people that design the game, and they have the developers right there next to the game telling you how it works. But they kind of grew, and you go to these kind of big spaces, you don't really get to chat to the developer at all. And in fact, if you go to them nowadays, you'll probably just chat to a marketing person, right? Or someone that maybe has even been specifically hired just to kind of stand there and ferry you to the next free Nintendo game to play, whatever, right? So you know that I'm not picking on Nintendo there. That was just what came to my head. But you know that's kind of how they work now. So Ian wanted to kind of create a festival that kind of was a place where people could come and play with games and experiment with games, and also kind of actually kind of get interact with the people behind the games as well. And this was around 2005, 2006 time, and there was a few things going on around kind of video game culture there. And I'm probably diverting off the script here, so if Ian does want to correct me, then please do. But this was around the time of the kind of the indie revolution of games, right? You know, there was that kind of big kind of explosion of independent creators creating games for this kind of next generation, like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, and you know, there's independent developers creating games on quite a small scale. Whereas previously they'd probably been much bigger teams. So it was kind of around then, and Ian was also inspired by his kind of history of 80s kind of game designers, where you had a kind of a video game auteur, or you had someone's name on the box of the game you were buying, right? So someone like Sid Meier, like, you knew when you were buying a Sid Meier game, you know, he was inspired by that kind of era. So created this festival, Game City Festival, that I think in his words was like an arts festival, but instead of artists, you have game developers, and you go in there and you have to do fun kind of game ideas, and you get to chat to game developers, and you kind of showcase the people behind the games. And it was super successful. It ran for 10 years in the end, up until I think the last one was in 2016. And was just kind of, you know, it was great, this week-long kind of celebration, kind of, it really had worldwide acclaim. They even had an awards ceremony for it. And after a few years of doing it, they realized that this is a good thing going on here. People seem to kind of really enjoy this. Why don't we take it from being just a festival, and let's do it in an actual space, right? Let's have a space dedicated to the kind of the ethos of Game City. And in 2015, they opened up the National Videogame Arcade right in the center of Nottingham, which was this kind of, like a year-long round Game City festival, right? With kind of exhibitions that you had there that you could go and explore and walk around it. After about 3 years of running the National Video Game Arcade, unfortunately had to leave the building, I think due to various kind of building issues, and kind of looked to relocate it to somewhere else. And this was when the National Video Game Foundation, I think as the organizer body was around then, started partnering up with a charity called the BGI, an organization called the BGI that since became a charity. And they got together and they decided that they were going to take this idea of National Video Game Arcade and turn it into the National Video Game Museum, because partly it was kind of, you know, the National Video Game Arcade was a museum anyway. You know, you had people coming into it saying, oh, this is great, but it's not an arcade. Where can I put my 10p's in? Why can I play Time Crisis or something like that? No, it was an experimental space. It was an art center of space. People were like, this is more of a museum, right? So they kind of took the decision to take that kind of next step and become a museum. And that led to us opening in the center of Sheffield in November 2018. And that's where we are, still there today, despite everything in the past year, I suppose. So yeah.
I have many questions with lots of, because that was thank you for that comprehensive answer. I have many questions leading off from loads of different strands of that. Firstly, I think it would be remiss of me not to touch upon like the last year itself. How has that been with the pandemic?
It was very nearly catastrophic, I will say. You know, it nearly wiped us out. Let's be honest. So 2018 wasn't that long ago. So we're still a new museum, and we're still a kind of independent museum. We are reliant 100%, well, not 100%, but you know, we're practically reliant on ticket sales of people coming and visiting the museum and spending a little bit of pounds, just come in, a few pounds just to come and sit inside the museum, play some of the games and experience that. And obviously when the lockdown hit and the pandemic hit, we had to close that overnight. Basically, we kind of closed that revenue stream overnight and closed the museum's doors. And we had no idea where the revenue was going to come to keep the lights on, to keep paying rent, to keep paying wages. You know, we didn't know where that was going to come from. Now, initially, back in March, we were like, okay, there's going to be a period of closure. Might be, I don't know, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months tops. So we launched a fundraising campaign to get us through that 3 months, right? So we can maybe reopen again in the summer. How naive we were. Fortunately, that kind of fundraising campaign, we set an initial target of £80,000. We actually did 250% of that target. We did £200,000 from that grassroots kind of fundraising campaign, which was like a very, very scary period, but kind of I look back on it quite fondly now, because I see the kind of outpouring of kind of love and support from so many members of the public that, you know, donated £10-20 here. And also members of the industry as well. You know, we had some kind of big industry donors that came in and, you know, gave us a fair chunk of money to kind of keep this organization alive. So if we hadn't had that, we would not have been able to kind of get through that initial lockdown period. That money was absolutely fantastic. Obviously, it's kind of this pandemic has lasted way longer than I think we ever anticipated. So, you know, we can't continue to rely on that. Fortunately, though, we were also supported by the first round of the Cultural Recovery Fund, which was good for us because, you know, partly we didn't expect it, as we're not a kind of, you know, fully accredited museum, and I'll come on to that later about what accreditation might mean. But, you know, there was no guarantee that we would, you know, be able to find support from the government to keep us going. But they did recognise our value as a cultural institution in the UK and did kind of, you know, did support us through that fund. And also we had another kind of big bit of funding from the organisation called the Yogscast, which you might have heard of. They're streamers, have like a YouTube, big YouTube presence and big Twitch presence. And they run a yearly Christmas fundraising event called the Jingle Jam. And we were kind of fortunate enough to be supported by them to kind of continue with our educational output, which we kind of kickstarted at the start of 2020, just before the lockdown, and has moved it onto our kind of online channels and was quite successful with it. So those kind of three pots of funding have kept us going. And, you know, I'm talking about kind of a lot of negatives there, like, oh, you know, we would have gone if we hadn't done this and done that. But actually, lockdown wasn't just a negative thing. You know, there have absolutely been some silver linings to these clouds. You know, we've been able to do stuff as a part of the lockdown, which we wouldn't have been able to do if we were open. One of those is the Animal Crossing Diaries project. So, you know, looking at how the lockdown has affected, you know, UK and worldwide players of Animal Crossing, or, you know, people that might not even play games, and how they kind of have used games to kind of get them through this really kind of worldwide traumatic event, I suppose. You know, we've been able to do that. That's kind of really exciting, and we've had lots of people kind of talking about it. You're more involved really in kind of what the kind of nitty gritty of what those kind of stories are. So kind of I throw over to you to see kind of what, you know, cool stuff we've got out of that. But I know we've had a load of cool bits out of that. Other couple of things we've got that, you know, we wouldn't have been able to do without the lockdown is the video game gallery project, which I don't think I'm allowed to talk about too much just yet, but I will mention it is happening, so keep an eye out for later on this year, because there's some really cool stuff coming out of that. And we probably wouldn't have been able to do Games Careers Week either. So Games Careers Week was a week-long festival event, I suppose, that happened all online and happened at the end of March this year, so just over a month ago. That was to showcase kind of career pathways into creating video games. So we ran, or kind of facilitated, a bunch of different events that were ran by companies such as Ubisoft and you know, EA all got involved. So yeah, the fact that we've been able to kind of, you know, do all of that in lockdown is great, and we're kind of really happy with.
I think we may have slightly lost you just towards the end of that answer.
No, yeah, I got your internet connection is unstable. But Games Careers Week, anyway, we did a lot of cool stuff with Games Careers Week, and kind of got a load of organisations together across the UK to kind of showcase career pathways and improve the diversity of the sector as well, diversity of the workforce within the sector, which was just kind of, you know, great to see, and will lead to an annual thing. That's for sure. So kind of we're in very early planning stages of what that might look like next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. So, you know, that's stuff we may not have been able to get activated if it wasn't for the lockdown. So yeah, positives, negatives, but we're coming out of it stronger than we have been. So all in all, I suppose positive.
Yeah, precisely. It's one of those situations where you have to reevaluate everything, and then I guess you've just got to find a way to make what the work that we're doing and the organisation is doing work. And what strikes me is in one way, the funding that you had from both like the government and from people, from a collective people, is like an affirmation of the work that the organization does. And I think from a sort of preservation perspective, that it strikes me is it's the unique way in which the organization, the museum, the arcade, Game City, that sort of history looks at it from a performative perspective, maybe doesn't look at it from a sort of traditional quote unquote museum perspective, where these things are all locked up in a clear plastic cabinet, although, you know, clear cabinets have their... So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, in a very poor way, like, what's the ethos of the performance? How is that borne out in sort of the exhibitions and the strands of interesting things that the organization's done over the few years?
Yeah, totally. I think it comes down to we'll probably chat about this a bit later on, a bit around. I'm sure we'll come on to the philosophy behind kind of games preservation and around kind of games companies and games preservations and the kind of the ethos they might have. But I think from a museum perspective, because there is this background in theatre, and a lot of people have kind of, you know, a lot of people in the organisation. I know Ian himself was obviously used to be really big into theatre. We're kind of keenly aware of the interplay and the interaction between a thing, a performance, and the audience member, right? And we're constantly thinking about kind of that, how we can kind of engage a person, I suppose, on the other side of the screen, or, you know, a person inside a space, inside a kind of physical theatre space or gallery space, right? So this kind of, it bleeds into our exhibition kind of our exhibitions and the gallery space probably most explicitly, but it's also kind of looking at how it kind of I think it inspires our preservation and kind of collections policy in looking at how video games aren't just composed of their code, right? Aren't just composed of kind of the digital thing inside it. In fact, video games are composed of everything that the person playing a game or kind of engaging with the game might interact with, and that's not just, you know, playing the game through a controller, but it's reading the box on the way home after you bought it from the shop, or it's going online and kind of writing up your own fan guide for it, right? Or it's kind of creating your own kind of little video game character out of felt or something, right? And so a lot of the stuff we exhibit in the museum, a lot of stuff we collect, is about this stuff that represents game culture and the way kind of people engage in games that aren't just about playing it, but are about kind of embedding themselves in it, right? So yeah, I think that theatre ethos bleeds through quite a lot into a lot of what the organisation does.
So in that sense, what's your favourite performative piece that the museum's done?
Okay. Oh wow, my favorite. I don't know. Hang on.
Sorry, so, I've got a question.
Yeah, no, favorite kind of like what I think what's key. So my favorite bit, actually, I will say this is my favorite part of the museum is whenever we do have events, whenever we have stuff that's probably quite explicitly theatrical. So my favorite days at work in the past couple of years was February last year, when we welcomed Masayuki Uemura to the museum, to the UK, into the museum. And Uemura was you still there? I think maybe I'm going again. But Uemura was the creator of the Nintendo Entertainment System. He was the hardware designer for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And just to kind of hear him speak about kind of his kind of history in games was... Are you still there?
I am still here.
Oh, fantastic! Cool. Yeah, great. That's cool. I keep getting some red things on my screen. It looks bad, but to hear him speak about kind of his history of games and kind of his really incredibly influential role on the how games have kind of evolved over the last 30, 40 years was just absolutely incredible. I think what my favorite line of the whole thing was when he was giving the start of his talk, of his presentation about Japanese games history and about the evolution of Nintendo and the games hardware. And he basically said, look, I was just a kind of a toy designer. I was just an electrical kind of engineer that just created this thing. And I thought it was pretty cool, but I didn't realize it would be an absolute worldwide smash hit. So I've dedicated all of my life since leaving Nintendo to working out why that is. And he's like, I have no idea why I was successful. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. And that kind of, I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. That kind of personal history of his and his kind of personal reasons for doing all the research that he does, because he now works at Ritzy-Macon University, was just absolutely amazing. So yeah, I think that was being able to kind of hear video game history from the mouths of the people themselves that created this history is so valuable and kind of so precious. So that's probably my favorite thing that we've done at the museum so far.
That was certainly a personal highlight as well of when we launched the VHS last year as well, as when Sam was with us for the launch as well, which was fantastic. So sort of tangentially then, so that's your favorite performative moment, and I think I agree with that, because I think that's a fascinating, hearing it directly from the creator's mouth is something quite special. So let's think maybe an object then. So in terms of a video game object that we have at the museum. So
for me, it's I do have a favorite object, and it's a ridiculous object. But my favorite object is we have two unopened bottles of Lucozade, which is ridiculous. Obviously the energy drink. Both of them have been rebranded as Larazade to commemorate Lara Croft. And one of them is from when they did it quite recently. I think they did it in 2018 to celebrate, I think, one of the launches of the new game, or 2017 to celebrate Rise of the Tomb Raider, or I think. And one of them was from 2001, 2002, when they celebrated the new movie, and they rebranded name Lucozade to Larazade, and it was donated to us by Ian Livingston, who is the chairman of the charity, but also obviously was the producer on the original Tomb Raider games at Eidos. It's a really fascinating item because it's not been opened, and we've got the newer one to compare it to. And the only reason I like it is because I really just want to open it and just taste it and just see what it's like. I'm not gonna lie, it's not even that closely video game related. I just want to see if this Lucozade still tastes exactly the same. My theory is it tastes exactly the same, and it's not changed in any way, shape, or form. There's too much sugar in it to make it change. It's like honey when it just stays forever. But we'll see. So I think so. But I'm kind of being slightly facetious there, in that I just want to see it opened. But actually, there is that Larazade bottle is quite reflective, I think, of my initial, passion of video games when I first started playing games. One of my first games I ever played was Tomb Raider, or I think it was the initial Tomb Raider, and being absolutely terrified by it, by the bear that was in the first level, and he had to jump in the water to try and escape it. That game just has a quite a special kind of place in my heart, I think. And I remember the initial kind of Larazade campaign coming out there, and finding it weirdly affirming of my own kind of passion, because there was still this kind of, around that kind of late 90s period, there was still this kind of thing that video games were this very niche thing, and you don't talk about games at school because you just get called a nerd and you won't be able to play on the football team anymore, that kind of stuff. And suddenly, I could go into a shop and celebrate my own video game fandom by buying a bottle of Lucozade, right? It was a weird, stupid commercial thing, but it felt quite affirming to me as a young kid. So I would say that, yeah.
I think that's fascinating, because so many different areas of society and industry and interest intersect with that one example. I think it also, the object, I think that's a really good choice. I think it epitomizes how diverse the range of video game objects and preservation is. It's as you're saying, it's not just the game, the code, the cartridge, it's the advertising campaign, it's the sponsorship deals, it's this more for sort of industry but passion project sort of intersection. I wonder how then does the museum sort of frame that interesting intersection between industry and the fan experience.
Yeah. So I mean, we kind of we actually have a whole kind of, we have these kind of cabinets that we have very traditional museum exhibits inside the museum. So the museum, to give you kind of a kind of brief overview on it in context before I go into this, when you do walk into the museum, it's unlike probably many other museums you might see. in that it's not like, usually when you go to a museum, you're expected to kind of go on a different exhibition to kind of walk through it in quite this linear way. Our museum is way more open than that, and you kind of walk into the space and there are exhibits or bundles of games, as we call them, because we group games together around certain ideas, that are kind of scattered all around the space, and you kind of pick and choose what you want to do, right? It's if I was to use kind of video game analogy, like it's more open world, right? It's the Zelda Breath of the Wild of the video game of museums, right? Because you don't have to take a certain route. You're allowed to choose and kind of allow your mind to wander. But what we do have, as well as that, is we have a kind of whole selection of cabinets that are filled with playthings that are, we call them playthings because partly kind of playing on this this attitude of this stuff is quite disposable, right? And it's just video game merchandise, who cares, right? And that's why it's just a plaything, you know, who cares, right? But also it is a thing that kind of symbolizes play, and particularly our play with video game culture. And a lot of these cabinets are filled with, you know, maybe filled with kind of official merchandise, like we might have the Halo 3 helmets that came with the Halo 3 special edition, right? It's to symbolize what are special editions. But also we have a bunch of stuff that are just kind of fan made, that just kind of represent how users and players and fans interact with their favorite games. So we have like a whole section on walkthroughs, and we've actually printed out somebody's game facts walkthrough that was like 100 pages, right? Well, I don't think we've printed out all the pages. I think we've printed out a few and made it look like we've printed out all of them. But you know, it's just kind of representative of how kind of people just love these games, and all of these things and things that people can take home with them, but kind of, you know, just kind of representative of people's engagement with games culture. Because I think that's what kind of what we want to do, is we want to kind of at the museum, we want to showcase the overarching kind of reach of video games, you know. And when we talk about video game preservation, we're not just talking about preserving the play experience or preserving the code itself. We're talking about preserving the history, the context, and that's kind of really important, if not arguably more important than actually preserving that kind of individual game.
So is that the crux of the problem then with preservation? You have so many different strands of things that you could preserve. It's difficult to even identify what the game is. You know, there's so many different versions of Donkey Kong, so many different versions of Pac-Man. Yeah. So how do you then, and so many, you know, offshoots and commercial deals, how is that the ethos? How, like, distilling what games culture is and preserving that?
I suppose there's an inclination to think that there's some sort of right authentic experience of a game, or kind of, you know, authentic kind of artifact of a game, and that would, by its primacy, that would people would usually refer to the actual game itself, right? So like the disc, I'm trying to think of, I've actually got a disc here, but it's just a DVD. Like it might be that, or it might be just the source code, right? And you know, I think there are definitely merits to that, and thinking about that, you know, you want to preserve the original authentic artifact of a game. But there are so many, games are such a amorphous kind of art form and a medium that they are always moving, and that there is no kind of actual, when you kind of really start to kind of look into this stuff, there oftentimes is no kind of original kind of artifact of a game. Like if we wanted to collect Minecraft, for example, what version of Minecraft would we want to collect? If we wanted to make sure we had that source code preserved and we were kind of constantly updating it to new kind of storage formats, what actual original artifact of Minecraft do we want to actually save? Is it going to be the alpha version? Is it going to be the beta version, the 1.0 version, the 1.5 version? You know, is it the Bedrock edition? Like there are so many different things around video games that even finding that kind of original authentic artifact of it is really difficult. So yeah, like it really is. And I think choosing what to collect and why we're kind of collecting it really is, like you said, the crux of the argument. I haven't really got an answer for you about what you should be looking to collect. I mean, I wouldn't know, and I imagine kind of Ian and Lex on this call might have a much better idea than I do anyway. But yeah, I think you're on the money there with about the crux of what the issue is around video game preservation. There's just a lot of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the good things about the VHS is that, you know, we're trying to bring all these different ideas and different ways of collecting and preserving together. Maybe not to make a great monolith of this is the preservation idea, but maybe just to, you know, collaborate on or you could do it like this way, and you can do it like this way, and these things can also sit in side by side. It's interesting that you actually mentioned Minecraft as well, because I think one of the recent questions on our discourse forum was how do we go about preserving Minecraft worlds, which were sort of seeds and things that have already been created. I think it was to do with Cambridge University. I think had a Minecraft world, and they'd made, or students from the Computer Society had made a campus from Cambridge. So like that very ephemeral digital form is a very difficult thing to preserve, and I think questions and answers need to be maybe not forthcoming, but they're certainly the questions that we should be talking about as well. Let's go towards talk about sort of the Sheffield connection to the museum. So how has Sheffield become connected to the work of the museum?
Yeah, so I suppose I get asked the question a lot, is, why Sheffield? Why did the Video Game Museum go to Sheffield? Because it was in Nottingham beforehand, and there are kind of two ways of answering that question. So I think, well, two answers for that question, I suppose. One, the reason that the Video Game Museum moved to Sheffield was, I think, primarily down to kind of logistical and financial issues. But also a big part of that was that Sheffield has a really strong video game heritage. It has been a kind of a national leader, and in some ways a kind of an international leader around video game development. And so kind of when you talk about kind of opening a video game museum in Sheffield, you can absolutely make sense, because there's so much kind of history that's embedded in the city as well. But then I think the other answer to that question is why the museum is still in Sheffield, right? And I think the reasons are slightly different, because obviously we've seen over the past year apparently the amount of outpouring of support from kind of people kind of nationally, but also quite in the city as well. Lots of people in the city have kind of donated money to kind of keep us here, and that's kind of fantastic to see. But also Sheffield is on the kind of I think on the cusp of being a really interesting, I don't want to use the term game city, because that's definitely Nottingham's term. Don't worry, Nottingham, you are the game city. You have the festival, but Sheffield has got a real kind of it's on the cusp of just being like a real cool place for games to kind of converge. And the reason this kind of wasn't necessarily the case when we moved here, but definitely is now, is because since we opened in November 2018, kind of quite coincidentally, I think, a few places opened up after us, quite close to us anyway, at least within the Castlegate area, that are also games related. So we had the Extra Life Gaming Lounge opened up literally just 2 minutes to walk away. Meltdown esports bar, where you can kind of go and kind of watch a load of esports at night and have a few drinks and play a few games. That's literally just across the road. You can see it from the entrance to the museum. And then above us, we had Barclays move in to create a kind of a incubation lab. When they get small companies in, Barclays give them a little bit of money just to kind of get them on their feet, and then they kind of see if they can kind of grow into something quite big. And that incubation lab kind of also saw what was going on, was like, right, well, let's make it games focused. So now, above the museum, directly on the top floor of the museum building, there is this kind of about 4 or 5 kind of small kind of games companies, or games kind of related companies, that are all kind of suddenly emerging. So there is a lot kind of going on in Sheffield, and I think I coined the term about just over a year ago, like the Sheffield Gaming Quarter. And I still think it kind of applies today, because it's, as far as I'm aware, the kind of closest proximity of this amount of games related spaces, both in kind of consumer facing, like a cafe or the bar, but also kind of in regards to kind of the industry as well, in regards to the Eagle Labs and kind of our stuff that we're doing in kind of games preservation. Like, we're all really close together. And I know there are lots of different gaming bars and kind of arcades and stuff in other cities, particularly kind of looking down at London, but they're all quite far away from each other. There's not one pure space where everything is within 5-minute walk. And that's why I think it's quite exciting. I think Sheffield's kind of on the cusp of something. And that doesn't take into account the actual kind of the big kind of developers that are within the city as well. When we're looking at people kind of like Bone Loaf, like Steel City Interactive, like Sumo Digital, or the BAFTA award-winning Sumo Digital, obviously won a couple of BAFTAs last month. So there's, that Sheffield was obviously, I think, some at the forefront of kind of video game development in the UK, and still is right now. So it's really kind of exciting to be part of the city.
that's a proper marketing term, the sort of the Sheffield Gaming Quarter. You're showing your roots there, Conor. But I think that's an apt term, and I wonder if there's any sort of, has there been a bundle in the museum to do with Sheffield?
Yeah. So to give a kind of context around the bundles, so I mentioned this earlier, when you kind of go into the museum, you've got lots of different things you can try. And so we have all of these are kind of brought together by a certain idea, or kind of, oftentimes they're kind of a creative idea inside the games, but sometimes they're a contextual kind of idea as well to kind of bring it together. And the context for one of our bundles is the Made in Sheffield bundle, where we just look at some of the really kind of fun and kind of creative games that have literally been made on our doorstep. So I think currently in the Made in Sheffield bundle, we have Zool, which is the kind of the 90s platformer. It came out on the Amiga. I think we've also got Snake Pass, which obviously is made by Sumo Digital and was released about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. But as you know, it takes its name from the Snake Pass, which is the road over to Manchester, which is quite nearby. So it's even more kind of Sheffield related, and it's about a snake. We've got, what else we've got on the Sheffield bundle? We've got Super Rubber Duck, which is a kind of really fun, interesting game for the PS3, where you have to use the kind of the motion sensors on the controller. I think it was one of the first games to really kind of focus down on that motion sensor and using it inside a game. And then we also have, I can't remember what the other one is. I don't know. Maybe, but I remember one thing we did want to have on it, we've not had on it yet, is Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast, which is probably the best racing game of all time. So, and that was made by Sumo Digital. So if we can have a chance to put that in there, that'd be great.
We'll issue the demand now.
Yeah.
Outrun Coast to Coast, please. That'd be great. I wonder, this is again tangentially related, sort of because I think that I wonder how that characteristics of Sheffield, that sort of Made in Sheffield, the Steel City sort of history, comes out in these games, or whether it comes out at all.
Well, it's such a variety of games. The other game was Tanglewood, made by Matt Phillips. It's such a variety of games that I think it's more that it showcases, Sheffield as a kind of creative hotspot, as opposed to kind of directly reflecting its roots as a steel city. I think there is one game that I think is, and in fact probably is arguably the most influential Sheffield game, that is one example of that. I don't know if you want me to go on a bit of talk about that game.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So I in regards to kind of Sheffield gaming history, I must admit, like, I am not the encyclopedia. There is a walking encyclopedia of Sheffield video game history, and that guy is called Mark Hardesty. So if you do want to kind of know anything about Sheffield games history, go and kind of read his book. He's got, I think, a book called Gremlin in the Works, which is all about Gremlin graphics. And he absolutely knows everything around game development in the city, around history, and he's an absolute genius. So I was able to interview him last year, actually, and ask him about this stuff, and he's great to see. So just want to give a shout out to Mark before I go and embarrass myself by talking about some Sheffield games history. I know he's just going to be shaking his head, but yeah. So I think one game that actually epitomizes kind of actual Sheffield and Sheffield history in a game is arguably its most influential, and that's the Monty Mole series. So I don't know if you're aware of the Monty Mole. Wanted Monty Mole was the first game, and then there was Auf Wiedersehen Monty and Monty on the Run. And there was a couple of others. I think Impossible Mole was the most recent one, which is in the mid-90s. But yeah, so the Wanted Monty Mole was a game that came out in 1984, I think, for the ZX Spectrum Commodore 64, and is really interesting in how it reflects Sheffield's history. So Sheffield, if you're aware of Sheffield, Sheffield is an industrial city, right? It's got kind of, it's kind of got its industry. It wears its industry on its sleeve. It's called the Steel City, for one, and you just walk through the city, you will see kind of steel works, that kind of history kind of represented everywhere in the city. And obviously that meant that Sheffield, as it's kind of industry focused, that meant it was a bit of a hotspot and one of the kind of the epicenters of the 1980s miners' strike, particularly the 1984 miners' strike. And one young kind of game designer, game programmer, Peter Harrop, he was 18 at the time, and his dad was a miner, and his dad was striking, and it was a very kind of tumultuous, politically charged time. And Peter kind of, wasn't really happy with what was going on, so used a creative outlet of making a game to kind of, that was inspired by this miners' strike, and in part was actually a definitely reaction to it, and kind of parodied a lot of the people that were involved in the Sheffield miners' strike, including Arthur Scargill, who was the head of the miners' strike, and actually is represented in game quite parodically, I suppose. And there are even kind of like he was known for, well, he was kind of the newspapers kind of made him out to be incredibly vain, because they found a picture of him with his briefcase was open and there was some hairspray in it, and you couldn't be a guy in the 80s and have hairspray. No, you would just you're in love with yourself. So that's what the newspapers made it out to be. And then in the game there was flying hairspray bottles that you have to dodge as Monty Mole. So it was, it was a very kind of politically charged game. This game was kind of a reaction to the miners' strike, and it was a smash hit. And it was actually Gremlin Graphics, who kind of started off as a computer store called Just Micro. It was their first kind of major hit that kind of put them on the national stage, really, and it got a lot of national recognition. It sold tens of thousands of copies, and arguably kind of kick-started the successful Sheffield game development. And it's also an incredibly politically charged game that is reflective of Sheffield's history. And it's quite interesting now when kind of industry is Sheffield's industry is nowhere near as big as it once was, but the Sheffield video game industry is, and may have kind of marked some sort of turning point, I suppose. Well, I suppose the turning point was probably much more before then, to be honest. But a turning point in where the city's influence, what the city's influence is doing over the last more recent history. That is a fascinating.
I'm never asked for permission to go on an interesting tangent like that, because that was fascinating, and that is something as a historian of the 20th century, I'm going to be looking that up with keen interest, because having Arthur Scott hairspray, that's brilliant. That is inspired.
So I believe he's the final boss, really, or you have to get by right at that level. The thing is so Monty Mole is a fun game. You play as a mole and you go digging and thing, and then in the sequels you escape. He gets locked up in prison by the Conservatives. So I must say, like, it's not a even though it's a politically charged game, it's definitely not the Conservatives were right to do the miners' strike kind of thing. Because actually, at the end of the game, you get arrested by the Conservatives for just being a bit of a troublemaker. Hence why it's called Monty Mole. And then you have to break out of prison in future games and you escape across Europe. But that kind of evolution of how in the third game you are going through Spain and across the Pyrenees is like just a really kind of I think a fascinating reflection on how this game did start as something that was quite close knit and was intended to kind of reflect the close knit issues that were happening at the time. And then once the Sheffield kind of games industry kind of grew and the video game industry grew, Monty Mole too, he also went worldwide, and he also kind of traveling Europe. So I think that's kind of interesting, that development too. But yeah,
100%. That's very interesting. I kind of want to ask, maybe, I know we're again, these things always run very quick of time, and I don't understand how an hour can go so quickly. But sort of the industry, the video game industry, and the sort of interplay between the work that you do, preserving older titles, preserving older game culture, preserving game culture just more broadly, and maybe an industry perspective that privileges new things, the next thing, and how that impacts maybe on the work that you do at the museum.
Yeah, I think it. We've spoken about this a little bit before. I think like there's this idea of succession, philosophy of kind of succession within video games, and that the next big video game is the only video game that really matters, right? And I think we tackle this we have to deal with this as impact on two separate fronts. So one front is in regards to the kind of the visitor experience, people coming to the museum. So people kind of visit the museum and they expect certain things based on how video game kind of culture is set up. So they expect from the museum to have this kind of probably quite linear kind of look at the idea of succession in games, right? And how, look, back in the 70s, we had to play on the Atari 2600 and the Magnavox Odyssey. And now we can play super crazy 3D games in 4K or in VR on the PlayStation 5, right? And a lot of people come to the museum and they kind of expect to be able to kind of take them through that idea, that journey of succession. However, it's not necessarily that kind of philosophy of succession is not necessarily something that's conducive to what we want to do at the museum, which is celebrate kind of the creative ideas and the people behind games, right? We're not necessarily I suppose we're not necessarily that interested in, oh, if the next games console can do 4K, great, fantastic. But have you seen this fantastic piece of art that was made for, the Atari 2600 or the Atari 5200 or something like that, right? So we do kind of, a lot of what the museum is about kind of, I think, fighting back against this idea of having to look at games as just a technological advancement. And this is probably quite different to a lot of actually other video game exhibitions that do kind of rely on playing through the history and playing old games, and now you get to play new games, and you get to play that games in the mid-noughties and stuff like that. So that's, I'm not saying we don't kind of look at the ideas of succession. We do a lot. We look at kind of technological advancements, but that's definitely kind of something that the core we slightly want to push against. And then the other kind of way that kind of way of thinking impacts the museum is from the industry side. So we do look at kind of current developments, in particular in regards to kind of people were talking about Sony quite recently. About how video game companies, video game developers, publishers, system makers, system and platform holders, in order to kind of keep functioning, they need to constantly be making new stuff and constantly making the next big thing they do. That's kind of how that's part of their business model, right? So we do need to kind of constantly be aware of that, and it kind of does causes a lot of problems and cause video game preservationists a lot of problems, because the people that make these games, people that own the IP to these games and the copyright to these games, aren't that bothered about the old ones anymore, because they're not really making them that much money. No, they need to put their energy and their resources into making new ones so they can keep their company alive. And it makes sense, right? But it is kind of a business model and a kind of philosophy that I think does need to be tackled in order for kind of video game preservation to thrive, I suppose.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think on another day when we had another hour to talk exclusively about the goings on with the PS3 and the PS Vita and the PSP, then representing, yes, we're here. There are dozens of us. I think that may be a conversation for another time. But time has really gone against us. But I see that we've had a couple of questions. So better for me to defer to the awesome questions of the audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If you've got any more questions, please feel free to post in the chat. We've got a first question here from Derek. Does the museum record, display, and interpret the underlying technology of game consoles and the software that runs on them?
Yeah. So we do. Well, we try to keep as much as kind of, original hardware of these kind of games hardware pieces as much as we can. And we do, if possible, also try to have this hardware playable, right? So people can come and actually experience what it was like to play on a Nintendo Entertainment System or something like that. However, that's not, when we're exhibiting games specifically, actually, a lot of the time we do use emulation as well. And once again, if we had more time, another hour, we'd probably discuss the ideas around emulation in games. But we do also kind of like to use, emulated version games, because it allows us to do a lot of things about playing with the player experience and showcasing different levels, for example, different parts of a game that you can't really do on the original hardware, and just, allows things to be exhibited a bit more easier, but also more creatively. So yeah, we do that. We do often kind of, a lot of the things we record though are, a lot of the things that we kind of preserve are these physical things, physical manifestations of games and games culture. So hardware kind of definitely a big one. Software is a bit trickier though. And I think we as a museum, we've taken the position that we are not actually looking to collect kind of the source code or the kind of the underlying code of a game, the underlying software of the game, purely because it's as anybody that's involved in software preservation, it is a legal minefield, and we are but a small team with limited time and limited resources. So it's kind of, whilst we would love to, and if the kind of opportunity arises, I'm not going to say no, of course, but it's just not something we can't really put that much time into, because the rewards are so kind of slim, at least in regards to preserving a lot of this stuff.
Awesome. Thank you for that question, Derek. Next question from Thomas Batty. Could you talk a bit about the process of tracking down new acquisitions for the museum? How do you find new cool stuff? Reach out to people, or do people reach out to you?
eBay. Also, yeah. So we don't at the moment, we don't purchase things for the museum, because we kind of, any kind of, you know, money that goes into the museum is you know, we're still independent. We're still not able to kind of, we're still not fully gone through the accreditation process, which means that we're not fully kind of supported by much or any public funding really. So yeah, so we don't exactly kind of purchase things, even though kind of we do really want to, I'm sure, particularly when there's a new kind of arcade cabinet that I just want to buy, you know, buy a Time Crisis machine, please. But you know, we don't do that. So I think a lot of the things we get are from kind of industry contacts, industry conversations that we have. One kind of big collection that we had was when we were chatting with the CEOs of Rebellion Software, so Chris and Jason Kingsley, and they had also acquired like the Bitmap Brothers kind of catalog, and they had all this stuff in kind of their loft, and they were like, oh, can you help us kind of preserve it? We're like, yes, we will do that. So they come from these kind of, you know, individual use cases of people kind of getting in touch, whether it's kind of through the trustee board, etc. We don't at the moment have a public donations policy open, or a public kind of collections policy open, and this is because we have done in the past, I think particularly as National Video Game Arcade, but you can kind of very quickly be overwhelmed actually by people kind of wanting to donate stuff and donate copies of their games that they have or hardware that they have, right? But it becomes to a certain extent where we run out of storage space, because there are only so many copies of FIFA 15 on Xbox One that we can store at the museum, right? And we don't really need that many, let's be honest. You don't need 500 copies of FIFA 19 to make sure you can preserve it. So yeah, at the moment it comes from kind of individual use cases. The hope is that once we kind of expand and grow, that we can kind of start to open that up again and kind of reach out to people, but it's still on a case-by-case basis at the moment, and there is no one, you know, process, I suppose, that we go through. Yeah,
I'm always struck by the story of Ian and James Newman. That's part of the VHS story, that they found an unwanted box of Guitar Hero related paraphernalia outside someone's house, and it was just going to be thrown away, and they knocked on to the door and asked if they could take it away. So, you know, sometimes it's just happenstance as well, finding these things that people just don't want anymore. Thank you for that question. I've got a question from MS. How would you decide which fan creations to preserve, such as game facts and walkthroughs?
Oh, I have an answer for it. Kind of which ones they are, because I got to kind of Ian and Jimmy kind of talk about this question before, but like in regards to like games as well, like there's only so many games we can preserve. We can't preserve every game that's ever released out there, so we need to choose what we do want to preserve. And do we preserve the best games, or do we preserve the worst games, or do we preserve games that aren't that exciting at all? And it's the same with kind of, you know, walkthroughs and fan creations. Do we want to preserve a piece of fan art because it's kind of exceptionally technically well done, or it had lots of likes on social media, or, you know, has a big influence? Or do we want to accept something that's perhaps more mundane, person or lay person's kind of engagement with kind of games? And I think a lot of these kind of questions are being asked by, well, I know particularly by Mikey and also by Lex, it's also in here, in regards to our Animal Crossing Diaries project. So a lot of that, we had an open call out for that we invited lots of people to basically submit their stories, and we weren't necessarily interested about going to Gary Witter, for example, who did the Animal Crossing talk show. We want to preserve your history. In fact, probably what was a bit more interesting to us was going to just somebody who, you know, that wasn't on social media or wasn't making YouTube or Twitch kind of content, and just kind of asking what their experiences was, and they're kind of quite mundane, perhaps pedestrian stuff, because oftentimes that's a bit more reflective of games culture as a whole, I suppose. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a hard and fast answer about what we choose to preserve, because it changes every time, I think. I'm not sure there is an answer. I don't know. I think you're right. I think as soon as you make a definitive answer, then you've put yourself in a staunch position that you have to sort of defend, and you've made a conscious sort of curation of whose history is important or whose experience is important. I think that's one of the interesting things with the Animal Crossing Diaries. The really awesome response that we had. So many interesting personal stories, like hundreds of them, and it was just really fascinating to see how this game and this
was captured this really unique period of time. I'm really excited for that project to come through in the next few months. Thank you for the question, MS. Another question from Abigail Chapman. Do you approach UK video game developers for their archival materials?
Yeah, so we do. We probably, I'm not sure there's too much we can talk about because a lot of these kind of conversations are happening, behind kind of closed doors. But half the time it's kind of us approaching, other developers, and a lot of the time it's developers approaching us too. They we talk about the industry philosophy about it always wants to make new stuff, doesn't want to look after its heritage. It's easy to get very cynical about that, but that's not really the case actually. There is a huge there are so many thousands of developers out there that are really interested in preserving their history. So they do really want to find help to do that, and they do approach us for it as well. So it's it happens both ways. And yeah, I think it's probably easier. It's arguably easier when they approach us, we will admit, because they already have an idea about what they want to preserve and what they are able to preserve. Whereas when we're approaching, bigger companies, there are lots of questions that need to be involved. So yeah, it happens both ways. We approach them, they approach us, and yeah, and it's it's a lot of it. I can't say too much, but we do have a scheme where we did want to talk to as many UK developers as possible and start to start showcasing their stuff on the museum as well, because that's that is key for us, as something that we're keen to do. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for the question, Abigail. I realise we've usually been very good with timekeeping for the first few of these VHS. This is the first one. I think we've definitely run over the hour. Thank you all for your questions. I've got to rein myself in now. Conor, thank you so much for joining us. That was fantastic. I don't think I've got an announcement for the next VHS tapes, but it will be coming soon at the start of May, which I forget is within the next couple of days. So I better get a move on with that. But thank you all for joining us. Conor, again, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you all next time for another really interesting chat. So I hope you have a great weekend, great week. Thank you very much for joining us. Cheers.
Thanks. Thank you all.